This is our look at the Federalist Papers. You need a little bit of help with this simply because your book is not very forthcoming with a lot of information. Your book might not feel it's that important, but the College Board in its presentation does, and it particularly focuses on three Federalist Papers, 10, 51, and 78. 10 and 51 come rather close together. 78 is about an independent judiciary. Now we can see that this is just a picture of the original 13 colonies, 13 states, excuse me. You notice that some of the states up here haven't been really created yet. We're missing Vermont, missing Maine, and these will be the genesis of the new states to come in the early years of the Republic. So it's a very stylized map. Now we know that with the articles, we adapted the name. Article 1 would be the style of confederacy shall be the United States of America, so on and so forth. And Article 3 talks about the United States entering into a firm league of friendship with each other for the common defense and security of their liberties and their mutual and general welfare. That didn't work out so well, because when we looked at Article 2, it says each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States and Congress assembled, it will be retained by the states. That's basically what they were saying. So we can see that in the groundwork of the Articles of Confederation, there are the seeds of its destruction. So we know that that's a problem. The Firm League of Friendship statement is a problem. And so consequently, we know why the articles themselves failed, simply because the national government had very little power. And we've discussed that in lecture and class. We know it didn't have the power to tax, it had no power of coinage, any number of things which laid out a weak system in which the parts had more power than the whole. We also know the articles had no chief executive, there was no national court system, there was no way to regulate interstate nor foreign commerce. There was 13 foreign policies instead of one. There was a supermajority that was needed to pass any legislation. The document itself probably never could have been amended, simply because you probably couldn't get all 13 states on the same page of the book. Now we see this, and the result of the Constitutional Convention is a tug-of-war between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists definitely had an advantage, because as they left Philadelphia, they knew what they had done. It then was incumbent upon the opposition to come together and try to provide an offense against the Federalists. And unfortunately, time wasn't on their side because of the travel time, the need to get the Constitution ratified, the fight between states. The Federalists from the get-go had a huge advantage. Now we also know that if we look at some of these, the state of Connecticut was represented by a wagon. The driver warns that, gentlemen, this machine is deep in the mire and you are divided as its parts. Down here it said a house divided against itself cannot stand. So we know that things were coming to a head. So we have talked about Shays' Rebellion, which occurred in western Massachusetts in 1786. It scared the heck out of the powers that be, enough to make a move to meet first in Annapolis, and then general agreement to meet in Philadelphia the following summer, when most of the states showed up. So we know that when we look at why the Articles of Confederation created such a weak national government, well, first and foremost, we were afraid of King George III. We didn't want another monarch. In order to do that, we wanted to have a strong set of states because we were afraid of not only a strong executive, but a strong national government. Shays' Rebellion shows the inherent structural weakness of any confederation, and the Articles of Confederation were inherently weak. So it became expedient to meet, and in Philadelphia in 1787 they agreed to meet in May, and they spent the summer meeting in that city in that hot summer. We know from our reading that George Washington headed the convention, Benjamin Franklin was the sage, so on and so forth. Now, the meat of this lecture. These are the writers of the 85 Federalist Papers. John Jay wrote the fewest. Madison and Alexander Hamilton wrote the bulk of the papers. I think Madison wrote a few more. Hamilton's are more focused on a number of things, especially the economics part of trying to resurrect the nation. Madison was more concerned about things like factions, for instance. So when we look at Federalist 10, Madison talked about the fact that factions, though he didn't like them, factions are political parties, would be generally present. The United States writers, or the writers of the United States Constitution, could try to remove the causes that helped factions develop, but realized that they couldn't, because if they did, that would certainly put a damper on many of the inherent rights that the states had in their Bills of Rights. So the second thought, therefore, was to control the effects of factions or political parties. That was really the only choice that he had. So in his case, he wanted to provide a Republican remedy in which he used the concept of separation of powers and checks and balances. And what that does, of course, is it divides government by its ability to do things, by the time that it spends together, and by the inherent separate powers that each of the branches of government have. They're all there to do a number of things, and one of them is to control the influence of faction by preventing a dangerous concentration of power. This was what Alexander Hamilton argued for, and what Patrick Henry argued against in their diatribes for and against the Constitution. So we see here, using Montesquieu's separation of powers, we have a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. Of course, the legislative branch was divided into House and Senate. The level of government, which we'll really focus on in the third chapter, a federal level, a state level, and a local level. That meant that government was incarcerated, like it was in Britain, in London, in the hands of a strong king and a very compliant parliament, or Paris, where it was in the hands of a strong king and an even sometimes stronger prime minister, or Russia, or any of the places that had what we would call absolute monarchs. So this is unique, and it's different, and it certainly diffuses power. So it's normally what we call this kind of movement away, and there's not one element that is dominant over any of the others. So the Republican remedy, when we look at this, I got to go back for a second. Go back here for a second. I guess I forgot. I didn't really write, but I want to talk a little bit about this. This is kind of a metaphor for what Madison was attempting to prevent from happening. So that we can see here that, yeah, some of the circles are larger than others, but because of the overlapping, because of these uh, kind of the dynamics in which you might be part of any number of things, and when you're part of any number of things, it usually diffuses the power that you're able to wield. This could be certainly the legislative branch, this could be the executive branch, this could be the judiciary, this could be bureaucracies, this could be the state, federal level. There's a lot of stuff here that makes it interesting because it's a new form of government. At the same time, when we look at Madison's Republican remedy, he knew that there would be majority and minority, not thought this time, but there would be an ascendant faction, and there could be a very vigorous but another type of faction lacking in numbers. And so what they sought to do, and what he sought to do as they wrote the Constitution, was to extend the sphere to increase the diversity of interests competing for the power and the attention of the government. They also wanted to create a system of representation which filtered out the selfish interest. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we've done that very well. The checks and balances allowed for an ambition to counteract ambition. So simply there, what we're talking about is kind of the first indication that they understood that government would be affected by a sense of pluralism, that everybody would be fighting for what they wanted, but they wouldn't get everything. And they finally settled on the thought that the separation of powers really does prevent a concentration of power. And by the executive branch having certain powers, the legislative branch having certain powers, the judicial branch having certain powers, and them all counteracting somewhat the strong segue to exercise those powers by any of the branches, the other two could certainly step in and say, no, you can't do that. And that's one of the ways that Madison was talking about countering the bad effects of faction and the ability of the government to simply see what the people wanted and then respond to those concerns. Now finally, a system governed by a majority means that minority factions will be outvoted. Well, yes, that is simply one of the rules in life, that will happen. On the other hand, there was a recognition that minority thought and minority opposition is important. That's why in some places, and including the United States, are called the loyal opposition and so on and so forth. They do, even when their thought is not one that is thought by a majority of Americans, we do respect that in many cases a sizable minority feel very different than we do. Well, come on, guys. I have to move this down a different way, I guess. All right. By James Madison's own words, and he writes in Federalist number 10, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse or passion, or of interest, adverse to the rights of citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. And what he's talking about are people on both sides of the fence, and these factions will come together many times on a large number of issues and form a party. And so when we're talking about a majority party, in 2002 it was the Republicans, in 2008 it was the Democrats, in 2010 it was a mix. And sometimes we have a real government that represents a majority, sometimes we don't. Right now we kind of don't. We have what's known as divided government. But majority, minority, we see it certainly in the 1790s. The majority party, represented by Washington, was Federalist, but people changed over that first decade. And by 1800, the Federalist Party essentially, except in New England, is dead, and the Democratic Republicans have risen. And so they're now the majority, and the minority are the Federalists. And that kind of stays that way with actually no opposition through much of the next 20 some odd years before the rise of the Democrats as they shed the Republican moniker, and also the Whigs, and then the Know Nothings, and then the rise of the Republican Party in the 1850s, and so on and so forth. But majorities and minorities do change over time. As people tire of the message that the majority sends, the minority message seems more, I don't know, effective, let's say, and people move over time to another side. And in our next lecture, we're going to look at 4 things that are really, really important. I need to talk about them again. Social contract theory we have dealt with already, but we will deal with it in a minor way the next time. But especially we're going to be looking at separation of powers, checks and balances, and we're going to prepare ourselves for Chapter 3, in which we're looking at federalism. Now the next one is actually, so we've looked at 10 today, we're going to look at 51, we have a short one on 51, so that you can start your Federalist Papers rewrite. So this ends lecture 4. Lecture 5 will be Federalist 51, and then 6 will be separation of powers and checks and balances.